Nobody warned you that it would feel like this. You expected difficulty, maybe, discomfort, sure, but not this. Not the sensation that everything you've built, your relationships, your identity, your understanding of who you are, is being peeled away from you like skin you didn't realize was borrowed. Becoming your true self isn't the triumphant, liberating journey they sell in books and seminars. It's a demolition. And the building being torn down is the only one you've ever lived in. Carl Jung understood this better than almost anyone who has ever studied the human psyche, partly because he didn't just observe it in his patients, he lived it. In 1913, Jung entered a period he later described as a confrontation with his own unconscious, so destabilizing that he questioned his own sanity. The man who would become one of the most influential psychologists in history spent years feeling like he was coming apart. Not metaphorically, he genuinely feared he was losing his mind. And what he discovered on the other side of that disintegration became the foundation for everything he taught about what it actually costs to become who you really are. He called the process individuation, the slow, brutal, often excruciating journey of becoming whole. Not whole in the way self-help culture uses the word, like filling in a missing piece and feeling complete. Whole in the way that means you stop hiding from the parts of yourself you've spent your entire life pretending don't exist. Whole in the way that means you let the false version of you die so the real one can finally breathe. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually discovered about why this process is so painful, the specific psychological deaths it requires, and why the suffering isn't a sign that something's gone wrong. It's evidence that something is finally going right. Because if you're in the middle of this right now, if your life feels like it's falling apart in ways you can't explain to anyone, there's a good chance you're not breaking down. You're breaking open. And no one ever tells you how much that's supposed to hurt. The first thing Jung recognized is that you can't become your true self without first confronting the false one. And the false one doesn't go quietly. Jung called it the persona, the mask you constructed to survive the world you were born into. Not a mask you chose consciously, a mask that was built for you, piece by piece, starting before you could even speak. Every time you learned what made your parents smile and what made them withdraw. Every time you figured out which version of yourself got love and which version got silence. Every time you adjusted who you were to fit what was expected, a new layer of that mask fused to your face until you forgot it was there. Most people live their entire lives inside the persona and never know it. They believe the mask is their face. They think the performance is the person. And in many ways, that's easier. Because the persona works. It gets you through school, through jobs, through relationships. It earns approval. It avoids conflict. It keeps you safe in the way that a cage keeps you safe, by making sure you never encounter what's outside it. The process of becoming your true self always begins with a crack in the persona. Something happens that the mask can't handle. A relationship collapses in a way your performed self doesn't know how to process. A career you built on someone else's definition of success starts to feel like a prison. A loss hits so deep that smiling through it stops being possible. Or sometimes, nothing external happens at all. You just wake up one morning with this quiet, nauseating awareness that the life you're living doesn't belong to you, that you've been performing someone else's idea of who you should be for so long that you have no idea who you actually are underneath it. That crack is where individuation begins. And it's terrifying because you're not just questioning your choices, you're questioning your identity. The ground you've been standing on your whole life turns out to be a stage, and the audience you've been performing for starts to look like strangers, and the script you've been reading from was written by people who never ask you what you wanted to say. Jung was honest about what happens next, and it's the part that almost nobody talks about. When the persona cracks, the first thing that emerges isn't your true self, it's your shadow. Every quality you've suppressed, every emotion you've denied, every impulse you've judged as unacceptable, it all comes flooding through the crack like water through a broken dam. And you're not ready for it. Nobody is. The shadow, in Jung's framework, isn't your dark side in some dramatic, cinematic sense. It's the rejected self. the parts of you that didn't fit the persona. If your persona required you to be agreeable, your shadow holds your rage. If your persona demanded that you be strong, your shadow carries your vulnerability. If your persona was built on being selfless, your shadow contains every selfish need you've ever swallowed. None of these things are evil, they're human. But you've spent a lifetime treating them as if they were dangerous, and now they're surfacing, and you feel like you're becoming someone you don't recognize. This is the phase where people often panic. They think something has gone horribly wrong. They seek therapy not to go deeper but to get back to who they were before the crack happened. They want to repair the persona, glue the mask back together, return to the performance that felt safe. And some people succeed at this. They patch the cracks. They reseal the persona. They go back to the life that doesn't belong to them and spend the rest of their years managing the dull ache of inauthenticity that never quite goes away. But some people can't go back. The crack is too wide. The awareness is too clear. Something in them knows, with a certainty that bypasses logic, that returning to the mask would be a kind of death more final than whatever they're going through now. And those people have no choice but to keep going forward, into the shadow, into the unknown, into the agonizing space where the old self is dying and the new one hasn't arrived yet. Jung described this space as the dark night of the soul, and he meant it literally. Not a bad week, not a rough patch. A sustained period of psychological disorientation so profound that normal life becomes almost impossible to maintain. Your old interests evaporate. Your old relationships feel hollow. The things that used to bring you joy register as empty noise. You're not depressed in the way the word is usually used. You're between identities. The old self has been exposed as fiction, and the real self hasn't consolidated yet. You're standing in the gap, and the gap is the loneliest place a human being can occupy. What makes this period almost unbearable isn't just the internal experience, it's the external response. The people around you, the ones who knew the persona, who were comfortable with the mask, who built their relationship with you based on the performance, they don't understand what's happening. They see someone who's pulling away, who's become difficult, who's no longer playing the role they were assigned. And they interpret this as dysfunction. Something's wrong with you. You've changed, and not for the better. You need help. You need to get back to normal. The person undergoing genuine individuation is almost always pathologized by the people closest to them. Not because those people are cruel, but because the persona served a function in the relational system. You being agreeable made their life easier. You being self-sacrificing allowed them to take without guilt. You being the stable one freed them from responsibility. When you stop performing those roles, the system destabilizes, and the system pushes back, hard. This is where the pain deepens in ways that catch people completely off guard. You expected internal struggle. You weren't prepared for the external cost. You weren't ready to watch people you love react to your authenticity with confusion, anger, or abandonment. You weren't prepared for the moment when you realized that some of the people closest to you didn't love you. They loved the persona. They loved what you did for them, how you made them feel, the function you performed. And the real you, the one emerging from underneath all that performance, is someone they don't recognize and, in some cases, don't want to know. Jung didn't sugarcoat this. He acknowledged that individuation almost always involves the loss of relationships that can't survive the death of the persona. Not because you're rejecting people, but because some connections were built entirely on the false self. When the false self dissolves, the connection has nothing left to stand on. And grieving those losses while simultaneously trying to find yourself is a particular kind of suffering that most people outside the process can't comprehend. There's a rawness to this stage that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't been through it. Imagine you've been wearing armor your entire life. Armor so familiar that you forgot it was there, and now it's been stripped off. Every interaction feels too close. Every emotion feels too intense. Every piece of feedback, every look, every silence from someone you care about lands directly on exposed nerve. You're walking through the world without the protection you didn't know you were relying on, and everything hurts in a way it didn't before. Not because the world got harsher, because you finally stopped numbing yourself to it. And if you're feeling that right now, that raw, skinless exposure to everything, then what I want you to know is that Jung would recognize exactly what you're going through. He'd tell you that the sensitivity isn't weakness. It's the first honest sensation you've had in years, maybe decades. The persona didn't just mask who you were to other people, it masked what you felt to yourself. And now, without that barrier, you're experiencing your own emotional reality for the first time. It's overwhelming because it's real, and you haven't had practice being real. If this is where you are right now, caught somewhere between who you were and who you're becoming, raw and exposed and unsure whether any of this is leading somewhere or just falling apart, there's a resource I want to mention. We've put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed specifically for this in-between space. Not to rush you through it, but to help you find your footing while the ground is still shifting. Click below if that feels like something you need right now. Because the middle of individuation is where most people quit. Not because they're weak, because nobody prepared them for how much it would cost. And the cost isn't just emotional. Jung identified specific psychological deaths that the process demands, and each one feels like losing something essential, until you realize it was never truly yours to begin with. The first death is the death of the ideal self. Everyone carries an image of who they're supposed to become, the best version, the perfected version, the person they'd be if they just tried hard enough. This ideal self is a composite of every expectation that was placed on you, your parents' unlived dreams, society's definitions of success, the standards you absorbed without questioning. The ideal self is the person you've been striving toward your entire life, and individuation kills it, not gently, with the full, brutal clarity of realizing that person was never real, that you were chasing a ghost designed by other people's needs and calling it ambition. This death is devastating because the ideal self was the source of your motivation. Without it, you don't know why you're doing anything. The career you were building toward suddenly seems pointless. The goals you'd set feel like they belong to someone else. The future you'd imagined dissolves, and you're standing in the present with no map and no destination. This phase often manifests as a complete loss of direction. People quit jobs, end relationships, abandon projects, not impulsively, because the engine that was driving everything has stopped, and they can't manufacture a reason to keep going in the old direction. The second death is the death of the victim narrative. This one is more painful than most people expect, because somewhere along the way, you built an understanding of your life that cast you as the one things happened to, the one who was wounded, the one who was wronged. And much of that may be true. Maybe you were wounded, maybe you were wronged. But individuation demands that you look at something more complicated than simple victimhood. It demands that you see your own participation in the patterns that hurt you. Jung was unflinching about this. He recognized that acknowledging your shadow means acknowledging that you're not just the person things were done to. You're also the person who chose, who stayed, who enabled, who repeated. Not out of stupidity or weakness, but out of unconsciousness. The persona kept you blind to your own patterns. And now, without it, you can see everything, including the ways you've contributed to the very dynamics you've been blaming others for. This isn't about self-blame. Jung was careful to distinguish between guilt and responsibility. The point isn't that you caused your suffering. The point is that you can't individuate while maintaining a narrative in which you had no agency. Because the same agency that participated in old patterns is the agency that will build new ones. If you deny it existed in the past, you can't access it in the present. Reclaiming your role in your own story, even the painful parts, is what gives you the power to write the next chapter differently. The third death is the death of belonging. This is the one that breaks people, because individuation, by definition, means becoming an individual, not a member of the group, not a reflection of the tribe, not a product of the system, an individual. And individuality, in its truest form, is lonely. Not because individuated people are incapable of connection, Jung argued the opposite, that only individuated people can connect authentically, but because the process of getting there requires a period of profound, disorienting solitude. You outgrow the groups that shaped you. You can no longer participate in conversations that require you to wear the mask. You find yourself unable to maintain relationships that were built on the persona's compliance. And the new connections, the ones that will be built on who you actually are, haven't formed yet. You're in a social no man's land, too changed for the old world and too new for whatever comes next. Jung himself experienced this. During his most intense period of self-confrontation, he withdrew from many of his professional relationships. He was isolated, misunderstood, dismissed by colleagues who couldn't see what he was going through as anything other than a breakdown. And yet, he later described this period as the most important of his life, not despite the pain, because of what the pain forced him to find within himself that couldn't be found anywhere else. This is what the pain is actually for. That's the piece almost everyone misses. The suffering of individuation isn't punishment. It isn't a sign you've taken a wrong turn. It's the necessary destruction of structures that were never designed to hold the real you. The persona had to crack because the real you can't breathe inside it. The ideal self had to die because it was blocking the actual self from emerging. The victim narrative had to end because agency is the foundation of authentic identity. The old belonging had to dissolve because connections built on performance can't sustain a person who's stopped performing. Every piece of pain corresponds to something false being removed, and that's what makes it so confusing, because the false things felt real. The persona felt like you. The ideal self felt like purpose. The victim narrative felt like understanding. The belonging felt like love. Letting go of things that felt this real, even when you know intellectually they were constructed, creates a grief that's almost indistinguishable from the grief of actual loss. Because to your nervous system, to your emotional body, it is actual loss. You are mourning versions of yourself that you lived inside for years. Jung would have called this the necessary grief, the mourning that has to happen before renewal is possible. You can't skip it. You can't meditate your way past it. You can't journal it away in a weekend. You have to sit in the empty space where the old self used to be and resist the urge to fill it with another performance. Because that urge will be overwhelming. The discomfort of being undefined, of being between identities, of not knowing who you are, it's almost physically painful. And the temptation to just grab any identity, any role, any label that will make the emptiness stop is enormous. People who resisted that temptation, the ones who could tolerate the emptiness long enough to let something authentic emerge, underwent a transformation so fundamental that they barely recognized themselves afterward. Not because they became someone new, because they became someone true. The difference is everything. What emerges on the other side of individuation isn't a shinier version of the old self. It's a different quality of being. Jung described it as a shift from living through the ego to living through the self, the deeper, more complete center of the psyche that includes everything the ego tried to exclude. When you're operating from the self, you don't need the persona because you're not hiding anymore. You don't need the ideal self because you're no longer running from who you are. You don't need the victim narrative because you've claimed your full participation in your own life. You don't need the old belonging because you're no longer looking for external validation of an internal truth. This sounds liberating, and it is, eventually. But the arrival of the true self comes with its own particular difficulty, because the true self doesn't fit neatly into the world the persona navigated so efficiently. Authenticity makes people uncomfortable. Wholeness, actual wholeness, not the curated version, includes qualities that the social world prefers to keep hidden. Your anger, your ambition, your grief, your hunger, your refusal to absorb what doesn't belong to you, the parts that make you inconvenient. The individuated person isn't universally liked. They can't be, because they've stopped shaping themselves to be palatable. They say things that make rooms go quiet. They hold boundaries that make people squirm. They live at a frequency that the unindividuated find unsettling, not because they're trying to be difficult, but because authenticity is inherently disruptive in a world that runs on performance. And here's the truth Jung kept coming back to. The pain doesn't fully stop. It changes shape. The acute agony of the dark night of the soul fades. The grief of losing the persona lessens. but the cost of being real in a world that rewards facades is ongoing. You'll be misunderstood by people who can't see past their own masks. You'll be alone in ways that don't always feel noble or chosen. You'll make decisions that look insane to people still living inside their personas and feel entirely right to you. The pain shifts from the violence of transformation to the quiet ache of being authentic in a world that isn't. So why would anyone go through this? Why not just keep the persona, maintain the mask, perform the version that gets rewarded? Because Jung discovered something that changed everything he understood about the human psyche. The persona doesn't just limit what you show the world, it limits what you can experience. Inside the mask, your emotional range is restricted to what the performance allows. Your capacity for joy is capped by the same mechanism that caps your capacity for grief. Your ability to love fully is blocked by the same walls that protect you from being fully seen. The persona doesn't just hide you from others, it hides life from you. Individuation doesn't just give you access to your true self, it gives you access to the full spectrum of human experience. The lows are lower, yes. The grief hits harder. The loneliness cuts deeper. But the joy is more vivid than anything the persona ever allowed you to feel. The love is more real because it's no longer filtered through performance. The peace, when it comes, and it does come, isn't the manufactured calm of someone managing their image. It's the genuine stillness of someone who has nothing left to hide. Jung spent the second half of his life helping people understand that this trade-off is worth it. That a life lived authentically, even with all its pain, is fundamentally richer than a life spent performing, no matter how comfortable the performance. That the suffering of individuation isn't the price of failure, it's the price of admission to a life that's actually yours. And he was careful to distinguish between the pain of individuation and the pain of avoidance. Because both paths hurt. Staying in the persona hurts, it just hurts in ways that are socially acceptable and easy to numb. The dull ache of inauthenticity, the quiet desperation of living someone else's life, the slow erosion of vitality that comes from suppressing who you actually are for decades. That pain is real too. It's just so normalized that most people don't recognize it as pain. They call it adulthood. They call it responsibility. They call it just how things are. Individuation hurts differently. It hurts acutely, visibly, in ways that can't be numbed or ignored. But the pain of individuation is the pain of something healing. The pain of avoidance is the pain of something dying slowly. And Jung believed, based on decades of watching both paths play out, that the pain of becoming who you actually are, as devastating as it is, leads somewhere. The pain of avoiding who you are just keeps circling. If you're in this process right now, if you're raw and disoriented and grieving things you can't fully name, you don't need someone to fix you. You need someone to tell you the truth about where you are. You're not falling apart, you're falling into yourself. And the reason it hurts this much is because everything that isn't you is being burned away, and you've been so fused with those things that their removal feels like losing limbs. It isn't. It's losing armor. And underneath the armor, underneath the persona, underneath every layer you built to survive a world that asked you to be someone other than who you are, there's someone real. Someone who's been waiting, patiently and sometimes not so patiently, for you to stop performing long enough to notice they exist. That person is worth the pain. Jung staked his entire body of work on that belief, not because the real you is perfect or enlightened or guaranteed a happy ending, but because the real you is the only version that can actually live. Everything else is just survival, and you've survived long enough. The most painful thing you will ever do is become yourself. Not because there's something wrong with who you are, because there's so much that was built on top of it, and removing those layers requires a kind of honesty that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It requires you to look at what you've been hiding, to grieve what you've been pretending, to let go of who you thought you were supposed to be, and stand in the terrifying, exhilarating, completely uncertain space of who you actually are. Jung wouldn't promise you that it gets easier. He'd promise you that it gets realer. And that real, even when it's painful, is the only thing worth building a life on. The persona was someone else's blueprint. The ideal self was someone else's dream. The victim narrative was someone else's cage. Your true self is the first thing that's actually, entirely, uncompromisingly yours. And becoming it, that slow, agonizing, irreversible shedding of everything borrowed, is the most important thing you'll ever do. Not despite the pain, through it. Because the pain is the doorway, and what's on the other side is the life you've been aching for without knowing its name. If you're somewhere in the middle of this right now, still raw, still unsure, still waiting for the ground to solidify beneath you, we put together something that might help. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built for exactly this stretch of the journey. Not to rush you through it, to walk with you while you're in it. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.